I'm Molly Rowe, and this is my expert talk for LIS 654, and today I'm going to be talking about digitization in colonial archives. Digital archives began to emerge in the late 1990s with the advent of new technologies that made digitizing possible. Libraries and archives quickly began to use this technology. In 1994, the Commission on Preservation and Access and the Research Libraries Group Task Force on Digital Archiving was formed. In 1996, they published a report that discussed how to use digital archives to be able to preserve records for longer than ever before, and the challenges and potential solutions of digital archives. They also tried to encourage institutions to invest in digitization efforts. In 2003, there was also the Research Library Group National Archives and Records Administration Joint Task Force, who met to create a criteria to certify digital repositories. Digital archives have the potential to create third spaces in which local populations have more control over their ancestral materials and records. Colonial archival practices have traditionally whitewashed history, and new ways of creating archives in the digital world can help document and record previously neglected truths and histories. Archivists are exploring new ways in which digital archives can be used to decolonize archives. One example of a colonial archive that has recently gone through digitization is the Virgin Islands. Denmark sold what is now known as the Virgin Islands to the United States in 1917 for $25 million. Some of the records and archives were then transferred to Danish archives, some went to the United States, and very little was actually left in the Virgin Islands. Although the United States and Denmark had legal claims over their records, they were not the subjects of the records, and the Afro-Caribbean locals had very limited, if any, physical access to their ancestral material and heritage that was kept in those records and archives. The local population experienced a 250-year gap in their own records that they had access to in the Virgin Islands. In order to remedy the issue of access, there was a digitization effort that took place between 2013 and 2017, where they digitized 1.2 kilometers of shelves, and their goal was to give more people in the Virgin Islands access to this material. This archive is now on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it is considered one of the best digital collections in the world. One of the biggest issues with digital colonial archives is ownership. Most colonial archives consist of trade records and government documents, and they tend to leave out truths in history of enslaved and indigenous populations and only focus on European history. Usually the colonial archives are still owned by colonizers, and they're often scattered and hard to access by local populations. The records that do exist involving minority groups are often poorly cared for and misunderstood. The parties in these records oftentimes were non-consenting, and even after enslaved people were emancipated, their personal records remained the custody of their enslavers. Records exist in the same context in which they were created. There is also the issue of the racialized view of privacy as a privileged form of property that can only be claimed by those who own themselves. In most cases, no rights were granted to the people that are hidden in these archives. The issue of ownership was challenged when Tamara Lanier filed a lawsuit against Peabody Museum at Harvard University for rights to photographs of Renty, her ancestor. Renty was photographed naked by a Harvard professor as part of his project to support polygenism, which is the theory that different races have different human origins. Harvard was not taking proper care of these images, and they were actually profiting off of these images. Harvard was perpetuating the dynamics of slavery, which denied African Americans the right to own, claim, or inherit property. When thinking about decolonizing digital archives, we need to think about how to decolonize archival practices. We need to resist archival norms of how we curate and manage collections. There needs to be more of an ethics of care that requires more sensitivity, especially for images of atrocities and images that are traumatic for people that are alive today. We need to consider how to allow people to have more of a say in what is shared, and how it is accessed. We also have to consider what decolonization means in a digital setting. Temi Adumosu asks, what is the best way to attend to violated bodies and biographies without replicating historical patterns of abuse? Archivists are striving to decolonize items in archives by means of digitization. There is an effort to digitally repatriate archives and strive to give Black and Indigenous people more control over their cultural materials and records in a separate digital space. While these items may be digitally repatriated in a separate space, they are still physically in the custody of former colonizers. There are many potential benefits to digitization. The neglect of care and records involving Black and Indigenous people can be potentially corrected through digitalization. There are repatriation efforts that are in place in order to repatriate and restore identities that are lost in archives, especially in photographs that are mislabeled and misunderstood. There are new opportunities to redescribe, label, and categorize these materials. Black and Indigenous populations can have more access and hopefully more control over these materials in a digital space. There is also the potential to remove language barriers through means of translation in digital spaces. And all of these things combined allow for more histories and truths to be recorded and included. There are inherent issues with digital archives. Even though digital items may provide more access and opportunities for collaboration, they do not provide any physical ownership. Former colonial powers are still in control and in the power of these materials and these archives. They lack accountability, and this power dynamic perpetuates colonial relationships. Dr. Sutherland herself asks, who controls the digital afterlives of those whose lives have been stolen? There is also the issue of language barriers. Many archives are in the language of the colonial power. In the example that I gave before with the Virgin Islands, most of those records are in Dutch, and while some have been translated in the digital space, many have not, and it limits the access of local populations. A lot of these digital archives require internet access also, and a lot of rural areas might not have access to internet in the same way that Western communities do. There is also a big issue with access. Like I said, internet access means that rural communities might not be able to access these archives. Items on the web can also be accessed by anyone, which raises the question, should anyone be able to access this sensitive material? What should be off limits, and what should limiting that access look like? And also, who should decide who gets access and who does not? One of the underlying themes of all these questions is that local populations need to be not only more involved with these decisions, but they also need to be given more access to the control of their own heritage and their own cultural materials that are associated with that. Digital archives are attempting to decolonize and repatriate material in a digital setting. This is the first time since the beginning of colonization that marginalized groups might be able to access and contribute to their own archives, and history is being greatly benefited by this process. However, while the ideal is revolutionary, colonial powers are still in control of these archives, the lives of the people in the archives, and their history. The power being given to Black and Indigenous populations in digital archives is conditional, and the overall colonial dynamics are still at play. This isn't to say that we shouldn't be proud of the success that digital archives have made, but we also need to consider how we can do better going forward.